thank you all for joining us today. You're welcome to our kind of Securing Your Recovery, essentially a session today that's going to be focused around helping take a look at, how we can work together to modernize our backup and recovery deployments. Today, you're joined by two speakers from our side. You have myself, if my slide will move forwards. So Phil Mercer. For those of you who may have spoken to me previously, you might have heard my tagline as saying I'm technical but not the techie. But essentially, I do a few different roles at PowerOn, but my kind of experience is working across a lot of different technology from a management security arena, but I really help look to bring together that business requirements side together with the technical solution end, and ultimately really supporting to get the right fit between those, making sure the solution works for the business, but ultimately gets us the technical outcomes and the service outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Joined by my colleague Kevin. If Kevin, you'd like to say hello.
Morning, everyone. I hope you're all well. My name's Kevin Green. As it states, I'm a veteran. Looking at the picture, you can see the grey hairs, but it has all been 34 years so far of fun and interesting times. My background's predominantly for the last 30 years plus in storage, recovery, and infrastructure. For the last 10 years, I've been basically the global knowledge trainer and primary professional service delivery for a major backup vendor. So my job is to make sure that it's implemented correctly, but also understand the design, customer requirements, and also the customer outcome.
So as we kind of go into the session today, a couple of key pieces for us. We're the kind of place really that likes to share knowledge as a primary. So ultimately, we're not here to give you a sales pitch today, but we're really looking to kind of share knowledge with you around some of those key elements that can help make up a modern recovery approach. So thinking a little bit around how we actually would define that and think about how would this really work for delivering to our organization. Ultimately, of course, whenever you share knowledge, I tend to quite often use the term independent with a preference. So we'll, of course, look to share with you our experiences, the kind of expertise that we will have and how we've seen this work for customers. And really we bring that from a background of, as Kevin said there, good, strong infrastructure side, but also marrying that in with that cyber security and the whole kind of profile around IT management. Ultimately, what we really want this session to ideally do for you all is help with supporting that understanding and awareness. And really, we're kind of looking at this from a point of view, as well as we commonly support businesses to really define what that kind of roadmap looks for them. And we kind of talk to that in this aspect of risk profile. So kind of some of the parts that we'll talk to today is thinking around, well, actually, yes, there might be what some will call best practice or recommended practices. But ultimately, we need to find something that fits what the business is willing to accept. And that's looking at how that risk and that acceptance of risk kind of marries in with the solution that we're looking for. We'll look to do that by providing, a view of the kind of that security configuration that we can bring to bear with a recovery solution, but also kind of looking to marry that in with actually what kind of technologies then could be used in that case. So look to the function and then look to some example of the kind of tools that are used. Ultimately, as you say, not to try and sales or pitch those things in, but really with the intent of looking to help you buy or use the services and solutions you have today better. So if we look to that then a little bit in terms of how is the landscape changing? So, I think backup is certainly not new, but it is certainly fair to say that we have this kind of dynamic mix between what we probably consider as very much the traditional recovery requirements. And then, certainly in the last kind of 3 to 5 years, more predominantly so, we've seen a lot of kind of modern recovery requirements that have had a pretty substantial change impact in terms of what we need to think about when we approach the design architecture of our kind of recovery service that supports our business continuity plans. So we look to the kind of traditional recovery requirements. I think I would tend to describe these personally as that kind of natural disaster side of things. Now, of course, there is still, that kind of incremental individual file recovery events that might occur. But, we talk to this as an overall recovery solution, and we talk to that kind of major disaster events. So, the common things that we'll probably be used to from old, of power loss potentially to our data center, whether that's actually being flooded. Have an internet outage due to, I know one time someone managed to literally cut through the main line. That was always a fun one for one of the councils I supported back a good few years ago, as well as, of course, elements around major hardware issue if there's actually a fire or severe elements there. But ultimately, those are what you'd kind of refer to as those natural, kind of disaster sides and something that is, kind of more infrequent in nature. When we look to kind of more modern recovery requirements, probably not going to be a surprise to anybody on this call that we're going to certainly talk to that cyber attack. There's now a profile of threat and a recovery issue that we need to protect against in a fairly significant way. But also, it's also the change in working styles that we've seen within businesses, both from a point of view of certainly most impactfully over the last few years with the pandemic, but also the actual way of how we deliver IT service, you know, the change into hybrid services and our data being in a fairly highly distributed manner across multiple systems and outside potentially of normal direct network and access control. So we think a little bit around the traditional recovery requirements because they haven't gone anywhere. They're still ever present and something that we have to obviously consider and manage, of course, as well. But it's certainly fair to say that if we look at those from a point of view of likelihood and malintent, then it is certainly fair to say that, you know, the likelihood of those events wasn't massive. They did occur. I'm sure we've all probably gone through them at some point over the past 20 years or so. But it is certainly say that they were a fairly low intent likelihood. But one of the important differentials between traditional and modern is that in traditional sites, although it might feel like it at the time, you can't really necessarily say a flood has it personally out for you as a business or is trying to specifically take out your organization. So we think about that in terms of the point of view of the likelihood and the kind of the severity of the attack and other elements there. Now, what that kind of is probably fair to say, and I think no one would probably disagree with this in any major way, is it did lead to a fairly traditional piece around set and forget. You know, we'd have the service set up, we'd get it configured, we'd put up our first workloads, and then, you know, over time, it would start to go less and less on the priority list as it became more and more of a, you know, reactive service that we kind of get to when we had time. You know, we kind of tick that core box, but it isn't necessarily getting there. And unfortunately, that also meant that because of that likelihood and the kind of the presence of mind it had, it tended to mean as well that the systems were underinvested and under-resourced. You know, it kind of give that set and forget because we weren't getting the necessary priority from the business to put the time in and put the time against it. But when we start to then change that to looking at the modern recovery requirements and how that changes the dynamic of likelihood and malintent, although it's certainly not to say that it's now guaranteed that you're going to have a major disaster outage, it's unfortunately very fair to say that the likelihood has increased pretty substantially. And the challenging bit really that comes in with that is that likelihood increase has been due to the introduction of that new primary threat vector from cyber attack, where unfortunately it is very fair to say that that has a definitive malintent. You know, this is something where it is purposefully trying to disable your organization and cause direct damage and harm and prevent you from recovering. So what that's really kind of started to introduce, and it's positive effect as well as obviously reaction to negative side effects of that, is that the businesses are starting to see that as a much more ever present. The awareness at the board and the business level of saying that we need to have something that supports our continuity plans means that we as then that kind of recovery part within the IT structure would be very much more of that active participant, something where we will be much more actively involved within the continuity service and need to be, you know, kind of delivering that through. Equally, that's meant that, you know, there is more of a presence and awareness that the systems need to be regularly managed. They need to be appropriately resourced and effectively invested into. And ultimately, the actual recovery solution itself needs to be a secure bastion. So even if they manage to get through the walls, then you can't get through the fort kind of side of things. You've got that inner defense piece where you know that you've got a safe zone that you can recover from and take that confidence in that protection that it is a secure bastion for you. Something else that we need to kind of consider when we think about the way the landscape has changed is with that effective malintent, you know, whereas in a natural disaster side, it's relatively fair to say that it's a point in time activity or a point in time event and a point in time recovery process. And malintent, especially when we kind of think about it from a point of view of, let's say, ransomware as a primary, then, you know, it has a persistent attack type. So we think about that in terms of backups and the business impact that starts to occur as that, you know, a threat manifests itself across the organization. We see that obviously we're continually doing our regular backups and then the kind of threat somehow manages to get in. What then is happening is the attackers are moving within the environment, so increasing that level of penetration across the organization, ultimately hitting additional targets through until they get to the point of they hit their actual target. Ultimately, what that really is saying is once they get to a point of sufficient privilege then they're able to launch the more manifest attack, such as the major encryption of files, or such as the taking out of your command and control systems, such as backup. But ultimately, they've been still moving throughout the environment for an extended period of time. So, they've been potentially kind of affecting systems, kind of changing configurations, deleting actually out backups and recovery points or other bits and pieces. So there's been a sustained element that we need to be mindful too. And so essentially, we don't tend to always, unfortunately, in an event where it actually has impact, we tend to unfortunately become aware once that attack has been present for a good while. That then tends to mean that we'll start to monitor, start to respond, and ultimately what we have to think about as well in the recovery side, we have to go through then that point of cleanse and restore. So thinking about how then our actual recovery service, our backup capabilities and our resilience there gives us an ability to understand and recover appropriately so that we can essentially eradicate that internal malicious attack and work fundamentally back to a point of restoring normal operations. What that does is a couple of pieces to us, but it also thinks about bringing in additional targets that we might not necessarily have always traditionally considered for backup. And that's really around then some of the extended parts like your Active Directory, elements around, of course, if the attacker will go after that to try and disable, your general kind of user and access and privilege management side, as well as then things around DNS configuration. If they can redirect your users to bad sites, they can obviously reintroduce malware, even if you kind of restore services because you've reinstalled or restored bad DNS configuration. And that kind of also goes across general device configurations, so storage devices, networks, and other pieces. So something we also need to mindfully take into our backup routines and be conscious about as we kind of come into a recovery action and a recovery event. Kev, you wanted to take a little bit through the principles?
Yeah, cheers for that. Hi guys. So principles of approach, things to keep in mind when working out what's right for you. And again, key point, what's right for you? It's not right for everybody. So sometimes you'll find that basically this is a new terminology that's come around in the last few years, 3-2-1. So 3 types of backup, 1 on the primary, 2 replica copies, 2 types of storage, local device, which obviously is the primary backup. Then we're going to have another copy on either NAS or tape. And then we're going to have a cloud-based or secure offsite copy. So that's the base principles of 3-2-1. But again, it's not necessarily right for everybody. But then what came about later on in life is 3-2-1-1. So if it wasn't already complicated enough, we now have immutability. And at the end of the day, immutability just means it's got a very reduced, if not no attack surface. And that can either be on-premise, off-site, it can be whatever, but it has to be immutable. It's an offline copy that cannot be attacked or changed. But again, it's what's right for you. I'm seeing a lot of people are looking at the 3-2-1-1, but then actually turn around and say, well, we can't do 3-2-1-1, but what's the minimum requirement? And what I would say to anybody, if you're looking from an insurance point of view or just a day-to-day data protection point of view, the minimum requirement would be a primary backup on site. You have to back the data up. You need to secure that as much as possible, which can be secured quite in depth. But then the last option would be an immutable copy, and that could be to tape or it could be to an immutable device. And then we've got, more importantly, things what people miss, monitoring and testing. I'm surprised after at least the last 8 years of doing this with this primary backup vendor that the more people I speak to is we do health checks, we do reviews, we look at systems. I'll get a message saying, oh, could you have a look at this for me? I'm not sure what's going wrong. And I'll notice that actually monitoring hasn't been done for like 4 weeks, 8 weeks. It's not about putting a man on a chair in front of a machine. It's about setting up the correct monitoring tools and making sure that the testing and the backup integrity is key. And more importantly, it's built into the software you're using. I remember 20 years ago when it comes back to the old school way of doing things, backing up to tape. We had to take that off site. We went to a big data center. They laid on tape devices, and we'd be there for 2 weeks, restoring everything from tape, trying to rebuild the environment. That is so time consuming. The systems today that we employ it's basically 99% automatic. So you should be just getting a report saying that my data has not only been backed up, but it's been replicated and it's been checked and it's been verified. And if you can work on that principle, the overhead that you should have to put in to manage this environment is minimal. But again, it all depends on how it's configured and what you want from it. So business justification, speed and resilience. At the end of the day, we'd all like to be ultra fast and we'd all like ultra fast systems, but there's a trade-off. Speed usually comes with cost, but we do need speed. More importantly, we need resilience. So that's the trade-off. And it is usually a cost, because at the end of the day, we could build a high-speed backup system, but there's no point having a high-speed backup system that may be compromised and we have to go to a slow, immutable recovery point. I'm not against tape. In fact, I'm one of the very few people that will always say tape has got a place and isn't going anywhere. And we all know that LTO 9, LTO 10, LTO 11, the roadmaps are there. So tape's going nowhere. The problem and the only issue I find with tape is it's the speed of recovery. Yes, the speed to send the data to tape is quick. But if we were sending compressed images or compressed backup locations or information, and we need to recover all that from tape, and let's say that takes a window of 8 hours, and then we've got to start doing the system recovery, that has to be taken into account. So the speed will come down to what is your last line of defense, because if your primary backups are still valid and secure, then speed will be less of an issue because you'll be coming from primary backup. But if we have to rely on basically the one of the one, we have to consider how long that will take to get back on site. Where is it stored? Is it in cloud? What's the line speed? What features do I have? If it's immutable, then it's tape, or it could be actual immutable storage. So that's basically a live device that can be in a single node or a cluster node. That can literally give you high speed recovery. And even if it's on a remote location, once you've secured that main location, basically unrack it and move it back to the main site. So it's more transportable and it's also high speed recovery. But again, this is where we balance in the cost. Tape is cheaper, but you'll be surprised when you look at immutable storage in most environments. We're not talking 4 or 5 times the cost of tape. We're talking probably 2.5, which makes a big difference. So immutable storage, but again, immutability is also tape. And then finally, multiple copies. We need multiple copies. So realistically, we do need a primary backup. We preferably should have an offsite backup, which we can use if necessary to bring it back on site. But all of this communication is encrypted. We don't have open networks. We don't have open ports. When we basically back up on site, we secure that as much as possible. When we replicate off site, we're only replicating over encrypted ports. I've seen the mistakes made where somebody's just basically opened up the VPN and anything can go across that network. Well, that's not going to secure this environment from attack. The immutability is less of an issue because most immutable systems, especially if it's a live system, can actually be snapshot every 90 seconds for an hour, every hour for a day, every day for as many months as you want. So the attack profile is very, very low. And then obviously we still need the monitoring, but multiple copies is key. As I said, I'm a veteran, as I'm called, and I'm paranoid by who I am. So I will always have 4 copies of my data, and they're on different systems. And then finally, the most important thing that people forget is security. If all this is open, not secured, not managed, not locked down, hasn't got the right security in place, you're still opening yourself up to a world of hurt. And that's not complicated. It just needs to be understood. So at the end of the day, the backup system is the only thing that should be really used on the actual box itself. I've seen people install other applications, other tools. As soon as you start doing that, you're making your main environment unsecure. So as a combination, the 3-2-1-1-0 approach is a perfect scenario. In reality, you might decide to choose 3, 2, and 1 and 0. It all depends. But like we've said, the most important thing is we have a primary backup location and we have an immutable. The nice thing is these other copies are usually at a lower cost than the primary backup. Okay, so again, back to business justification. Workloads. One thing I do get involved with a lot these days, and it's increased over the last, let's say, 5 years, is runbooks. Or basically, what is important when it comes to recovery. The amount of times I go into an environment and I go, right, have you got a runbook? Do you have a business impact analysis for your department? What do you have which actually says which are the most important servers? What's the point services the secondary requirements, the networking. What happens if the worst case happens? So when we're backing things up as well, the old days where I remember sitting there every night or every morning, checking the tapes, looking at the backups, thinking, okay, 80% of them worked. And I can go back 23 hours and 59 minutes if I want to. Workload severity now should be down to, if I need to back it up every 15 minutes with no impact on the live machine, and I can hold, if I wanted to, as many 15 minutes in a day, then I can go back to 30 dailies, then I can go back to 36 monthlies or whatever. That is key for actual tier 1 products. Tier 2 and tier 3, you can build your scenarios now and your workloads. But again, when it comes to recovery, that workload severity and priority comes back into the run book. What do I need up first? What is important for the business to run? So when we look at recovery time objective, again, that comes down to how long will it take? This is the speed thing versus balance against cost. If I lost my primary servers and then I lose my primary backup appliance and my only other copy is tape, then again, there's nothing wrong with that. But as long as the business understood and has said, well, yeah, okay, so if it takes 24 hours to recover the actual backups from tape, then it takes us 24 hours to recover the virtual machines or the physical servers as a system rebuild after, as Phil pointed out. It's not just a matter of going, yep, we've got backups, let's send them back. We need to do that clarification point, that cleansing point. Then we can start doing the restores, and predominantly that will be into a secure environment, not based onto the original network. So at least you're doing some due diligence and testing. But that recovery time objective is the key thing which will determine your costs. If you need a high speed recovery and the main appliance has been compromised, then you're looking at a physical immutable device or a second copy on a physical device. The cloud can be very, very powerful and useful, but you've also got to understand its recovery point objectives, what are available and what can be delivered. And then obviously, when we come to recovery protection, everyone thinks that the actual way it's a backup box. Well, if anything, it needs protecting as much, if not more, than your main, or at least the equivalent of the main servers. We need to make sure that nobody accesses the box who shouldn't be accessing it. We need to make sure restores are restricted. We need to make sure it's all completely protected with antivirus, ransomware protection, etc. Locking the firewalls down, the ports, even necessarily put it on a backup VLAN, and so on. We need to protect that box because if the worst happens, that's the box we need. I've worked with many customers this last 12 months on ransomware recoveries, and there isn't one fit I've seen. Surprisingly, I've had customers who've been hit and we've managed to get their main systems back within 8 to 10 hours because not everything's been hit or they've found the attack early enough. I've also worked with customers where it's been in there for 3 to 4 weeks and it's decimated their environment completely. And in their case, this customer has lots of insurance. So they decided to actually purchase new equipment, new networking, new storage, new hypervisors, and start doing the restores into that environment because they weren't convinced about anything in their current old environment. That is going to be a very rare occurrence. In a real world, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. You're going to have to restore to your current environment. So you need to make sure that what you're restoring is actually is valid, and you can actually test it. So we need to make sure that backup server is protected. If we don't protect it, we could end up going in a big pain world of hurt. And then obviously recovery resilience is all down to make sure that what we do recover, again, is actually viable. I go through it internally with the guys all the time. We test the backups on a daily basis, doing automation, but we also do manual testing on a monthly basis. We choose the primary servers, we bring them up in a sandpit, and we validate their integrity. So, structure of a secure architecture.
Cool.
Back to you, Phil.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there's a number of pieces there that kind of raise questions around, okay, what security we want to bring to bear. Now, Kev mentioned there as well around that, this is not to in any way take away from the fact that we want to obviously still be having that kind of cyber protection and considerations across the environment. So, we regularly talk to customers many times through what we kind of refer to as our protect, detect, respond, but ultimately it's just a framework where we work with organizations to make sure that that general, more wider business elements are taken into account. But one of the challenges with producing more security is ultimately security reduces flexibility. However, one big benefit that we have with the backup side, where we can take security as a kind of clear and present point of mind, is it is a single purpose system. It should be designed and it should be configured in a way where backup is only to do the backup, and it has got that dedicated considerations and design in a way where nothing else should be happening within our backup arena. So to do that, there's a couple of kind of key points that we would kind of talk to. We're trying to kind of keep the overall kind of piece relatively simple, but at the same time make sure we leverage modern tools as well as kind of modern best practices around how to manage that kind of cyber and that kind of security control. So first, in the context of that, would be around looking to kind of have isolation. Isolation will be looked at in two primary points. So we'll give a bit of a visualization as we go through this in terms of it, but ultimately it's around both really trying to limit that ability for lateral movements and ultimately looking to kind of have those additional layers of secure access controls to make sure then that we have validation of individual, validation of access profile and all that kind of good stuff. We look to reinforce that from both the point of view of segregating the identity layer and putting those access management to also then really kind of locking down the actual endpoint in terms of thinking around the security controls that look to take to limit action, limit the attack surface, and ultimately, as we said, backup instances should just be doing backup tasks. Any other tasks, any other processes should not be running on those individual boxes or on those individual instances. We reinforce that context of both control from an identity plane and from an actual device surface perspective, with really then reinforcing that with network connectivity. So yes, of course, we need to make sure that we can transfer data appropriately, but we do want to again think around how we kind of limit that and isolate that in as many ways as possible, just to really kind of limit the action that can be taken and the transmission and connection of data as we kind of move through it. We think of then, as we've kind of talked to in some respects, but ultimately that kind of context around the speed and the resilience side is at an absolute bare working minimum. We must make sure that we as a provider for that recovery side can have at least an assurance that we can recover in a worst case event. So, you know, you do get some pretty sophisticated attacks. They might be able to get past your first layer, your second layer. You need to make sure that we have that. Now, that can be as simple as keeping with the traditional OG of immutability in terms of tape, right? It's been around for 25 plus years and everything else. But of course, if you want to have that extra layer of speed, you know, to again, even in a worst case, have that confidence, bringing in some of that immutable storage or more kind of digital immutability into the kind of landscape can really help there. We then reinforce all of those elements in terms of with two major parts: reporting, thinking about how we actually then have that more active visibility of the health of our service. We do need to kind of keep a constant eye and a constant state aside. What we also really want to look there for is also those early warning indicators. You know, as you kind of see with some of that kind of mock out of, you know, the way the attack persists through the environment, the earlier we can catch it, the less work, the less recovery that we need to take into consideration as we kind of clean up. So looking to the actual data that's available to us, are we seeing kind of, you know, out of sorts kind of data rate changes? Are we seeing kind of large churn rate relevant to our kind of unstructured file data? Does that give us visibility that actually someone's doing something that we wouldn't expect, that should be checked out and validated to say, is that actually a symptom of a ransomware activity going on? And you back that up as well with then that kind of active management, leveraging things like the endpoint device control, the kind of access management services and the other parts that we've already put in play to give us then that greater level of visibility around the threat management. So the monitoring and management of vulnerabilities and things that will come through from a point of view of systems perspective. And then equally looking for that more abnormal behavior. So we're looking for data or insights into the data sets, but we're also looking for differences in behavior. So using those kind of more modern threat management toolings that can kind of look towards, you know, system accounts are now starting to take on unexpected actions or other moving parts. So if we take those components and start to think about, well, how would that mock out as an actual solution architecture? Kev, you can kind of run us through a little bit of how those could manifest themselves in, let's say, a model environment.
Okay, cheers. Right. This is a typical type deployment we think about and we come across day to day. Obviously, what are we looking at backing up these days? Everything's changed. It used to be just physical servers 20 years ago, and now we're talking majority is virtual environments. Not the key two anymore. VMware and obviously Hyper-V were around for a long time. There's lots of other hypervisors out there now. We're talking about remote offices, cloud services. It's a combination of now what we're looking to protect. And again, we just, in an ideal world, we'd just stick a backup server in all those locations. It doesn't work like that anymore. We've also got to actually consider the desktop estate. Since obviously what's happened in the last few years, I haven't actually left the office for 2 years. So we're not going into central locations anymore. We need to make sure that that desktop state is also protected and is available for recovery. So the world is changing and has changed. So when you're talking about current backups, obviously we need to make sure that the primary backup location is isolated. Absolutely recommended to be in a work group or a separate identity plane. More importantly, the firewall is locked down. So we're focusing on port access and only allowing access at the network layer and service layer that's required, nothing more. We need to make sure this is secure. This will be our primary recovery environment as well. So if we do have an attack and we can recover from there because we have protected it correctly and made it available, then a lot of the worries will disappear. So admin counts, robust policy sets, all the kind of things around app whitelisting, and more importantly, surface attack reduction in control in a complete package is vitally important. And also shouldn't be, as I mentioned before on the previous slides, the amount of times I see backup environments where you've actually got multiple backup packages on there because you've never removed the actual old one and we're installing a new one. You may have other roles on there. I've seen even to a point where I've had backup environments where the backup in server has actually got AD running on it, so it's in the domain. We need to really break this down and make sure it's a single purpose system, so it's completely secure and it's outside of any day-to-day management from the main systems. What do we look at then? Obviously, we're still looking at that secondary copy. So we're going into the 3-2-1 type of environment with even here the 3-2-1-1. But more importantly, when we actually send the data or that data needs to go to that secondary location, it's even more locked down. So literally only the ports in most environments, most systems would require 1 or 2 ports to replicate data. Those ports are also encrypted. So the backup at the primary environment is encrypted to the secondary. And again, the attack profile is reduced due to the port access. Again, it's going to be out the domain. It'll be in a work group. And more importantly, then, do we bring in the 3-2-1 rule here to the immutability? The immutability side, again, could be tape, or it could be a purpose-built high-performance system. And that could, again, be on the primary site. I see a lot of setups these days where we're putting the main backups on the primary site. We're then replicating to the DR site or the secondary location. And then we're actually replicating back to the actual immutable storage, which is back on the primary, where it would most likely be more useful in case of an attack. But again, we could actually move the immutable storage to the primary and go primary to immutable to DR. The replication side of the data is pretty irrelevant when you're talking immutable storage, when it's a live environment. If it's tape, it's a different conversation because that brings in management overhead, etc. Finally, down here, we've got our test zone. Now, in most cases, that could be some old equipment. The amount of times I've gone into environments and I'm looking at some racks and I'm going, what's all those servers down there? And they're, oh, they're 4 years old. We've expired them. We're not sure what we're going to do with them. They're perfect for an on-premise or remote test environment, not necessarily to do your DR or your recovery, but to do your testing phase. And if you can use that same software then to do your patch testing, your even application rollout testing in that secure environment with the environment that's built from the backup software, that again is going to cut down your overhead of management and day-to-day operations, but also secure what you're doing. Also, what's key as well is in that trusted, or especially in your any backup solution that you're looking to use for disaster recovery or even remote backups, is to make sure that if you are doing any kind of recovery zone testing, you're not just booting the last one. There's not a lot of point of booting just the last backup. You need to have a system that can actually roll back over a period of time. If you're doing dailies, you might want 10 days, 20 days worth of what we would call bootable recovery environment points in that environment. But that's a trusted network. So as we call it, sandpit, it doesn't have any access to your main environment. It could be on a separate VLAN. And the one thing I do always recommend when we go through this runbook procedure is, and we're looking at this recovery zone, is back up some of your desktops and put them into that recovery zone as well. The amount of people I've worked with, and we're bringing up the servers, we've brought up the domain, we've brought up the main SQL boxes, we've brought up whatever box is needed. Yeah, okay, that's up there, but how do we know it actually works? We can't assign it back to the main network because it's going to clash. Back up some desktops, bring them up into that environment and use the desktop applications to test any kind of internal apps directly from the end user, but in your recovery zone. So it's very simple to do and easy to actually use. Management services should be over another secure network and on a separately integrated machine. I find that the management services these days are overlooked in some ways. So it's actually better working with especially a partner who can actually bring in extra management services or security beyond what the product does. So yeah, we can do centralized management, but also we need to consider, if these are Windows boxes, we need to consider Windows updates. We need to make sure that they are not going to affect the stability of the environment. I've seen it where a Windows update is rolled out and the actual machine in question, the backup device, now won't function without rolling that service pack back. So even when you're running service packs onto these boxes, you need to also think about running that update process on a less primary box. Let's run it on the replica box, because if that one goes down, that's not going to affect the primary backups. We can roll this back, fix the problem, move forward. I'm not even going to say that how often I see this happening here and people have issues. So account access, yes, we've got MFA, we've got access within the actual backup software itself, but it's also putting on extra layers on the actual central machine.
Yeah, it also kind of gives a piece as well where if you think around that workgroup management side, what you don't want to be doing is introducing a single workgroup account that's shared within the IT administration side. So you can also use within that central management. We do simple like automation to do group membership management within the local workgroup devices if you don't want to go to a fully managed domain structure, because a fully managed domain could be a little overkill for some. But certainly that kind of simple automation structures can just give you a nice point of view of central management and certainly ease the whole local administration access into the workgroup devices for the backup servers.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, every time I do an implementation, we'll implement it out the domain. So that's a single service account with domain access. There could be 6 users. They want to actually create local user accounts with their own name, their password. That all needs managing, as Phil's just mentioned. So we need to make that as seamless as possible, but more importantly, secure. All of a sudden, we've got 7 accounts with access. We need to make sure that we can monitor those and we can audit them as well. Obviously, MFA now, if anybody hasn't come across MFA, multi-form factor authentication, to an old guy like me, it's one of the biggest pains in my day-to-day operations, because if I look at my phone now, I have at least 55 MFA access accounts where customers have given me access with MFA to do the implementation and do monitoring and remote connections. And I get to a point now where I literally do have to have a spreadsheet saying to me which one is which server's which, because if there's multiple consoles, MFA makes it absolutely, it's a better world. But again, we need to make sure that we simplify this and make it around conditional access, only giving it to the people who need it. The more people have got access, the more it's going to take to manage and the more risk is involved. Reporting. Again, some systems will come with a dedicated management console, which in general are okay. We'll get by. We give us just enough information. But then it's also worth looking if there are any specific reporting tools or dashboards that can make that environment a lot easier to manage, especially across different management platforms or different management consoles. Some backup solutions will have multiple consoles, so having a centralized one that will alert you to things like Phil mentioned earlier. All of a sudden, our backups have been doing incremental for the last month, and they're only backing up 1 gig a day. Then all of a sudden, there's a massive spike. Why is that spike? You can go and investigate it. So it's about alerting you to a potential issue before it happens. But it's also understanding and getting a simple dashboard that you can connect to. So that reporting side is absolutely critical to, again, making our day-to-day life easier. We don't need to spend or have a dedicated person as such on the backups anymore, but if we don't actually make that reporting, health monitoring and security reporting simpler, they end up basically looking at multiple consoles or spending a lot of time also looking into things that actually aren't an issue. I've had a lot of people say to me, oh, the backup's failed. Yeah, it has, but then it automatically retries the backup and it works. So ignore the failure. Did it back up 1 minute later? If it keeps failing, then that's a warning point, but don't go and spend time on something that actually fixes itself unless it keeps happening, and then you need to actually review it. Threat monitoring is critical. If we can actually bring that threat level down, especially abnormal behavior, and that could be anything that somebody's logged onto the box who shouldn't be on there. It could be malintent. It could be anything that's happening on that environment. We need to make sure that if we can actually monitor that and react quicker, then we're going to have less chance of loss. And we're talking here predominantly, that's not just the backup environment. The threat monitoring should be integrated into the full system. But yeah, the threat monitoring from the backup environment is key as the main environment itself. So that's basically a secure recovery architecture. Protect everything to primary, multiple replica points with immutability, could be tape or physical, and then recovery and testing in a recovery zone. And that recovery zone could be a DR environment. So you could actually be ready to spin up as well there. But one thing I would say is if you are looking at a DR's disaster recovery service, don't class that as a testing environment. It's being built and populated and maintained for a specific reason, to get you out last line of defense. I've seen too many people play with it and go, oh, I'm just going to boot it all just to see what happens. No, let's do it through a process delivery and make sure it's actually managed correctly. If you've got some old kit, fine, use that for testing and playing with and so on. Finally, this is a sample. It's basically toolings. What we've been talking about, obviously, our vendor of choice is Arcserve, and we specifically specify on UDP. Obviously, we've got the SaaS service, the Office 365 integration, all the Microsoft tools are in there. So that's the primary, what also we're protecting using the software. The primary box, absolutely 2019, actually now 2022, but 2019 will be the minimum operating system. And from what I understand that my colleague at PowerOn, Steve, 2022 is even more advanced and has got more security features, etc. Microsoft Defender for Cloud, a very, very in-depth, powerful solution. The Defender word, and I'm going to be the first one to admit it, my lack of knowledge always led me to believe the Defender was actually the lower end. Actually, if you implement Defender for Cloud correctly and in the environment, it is so powerful. But again, it's like any solution. It's easy if you know how. That's what Phil's always said to me. So Defender for Cloud, PowerOn Recovery, what are we talking about there? So these are appliances, but also they could be an Arcserve UDP appliance, currently the 9000 series, or they could be one of ours. Depends on how we deploy it and how the customer wants to work. The offsite unit, so our secure replicated copy, would be another PowerOn Recovery unit, running the same sort of environment, but again, secured even more. Then we basically got the OneSafes or tape backup. So the OneSafes are the physical appliance built around a completely secure, immutable platform, even to the point where even if you could get onto, like, say, the lights out management board, you can't do anything because there is no RAID array. It's all held within the secure operating system. You can't get into the operating system because there's a management layer at the web console and the command line that doesn't let you do anything. So these are extremely secure and will snapshot every 90 seconds for an hour, every hour for a day, and every day for as long as the storage. And also, when you run out of space for one, you can just literally connect another one in and you can build a cluster up to 7 units. But if that's too rich for some people or budgets, don't rule out tape. Tape can be very functional if designed correctly, because at the end of the day, within this type of environment, we can have backup silos. So we can send tier 1s to one data location, tier 2 to another, and then we can also protect them at the tape level using the same methodology. So on a restore, we're going to want the tier 1s back first. So if the tier ones are only 10 terabytes, but the whole backup repository is 80, we don't want to be basically waiting for 80 terabytes to come back before we can start the recovery. Well, let's segment it here, allowing us to do a 10 terabyte restore on an LTO8. That's about 9 hours. That's a big difference to 4 days. Or again, if we've got the actual budgetary allowance, we should be looking at a live physical appliance itself. And then we've got the recovery zone, where we've got literally dedicated recovery appliances which are tuned and built to the amount of compute resources you require. So if you need 384 gig of RAM, you need 180 cores, and you need so many IOPS and storage, that could be one unit. And that example I've just given you, even with literally 40 terabytes, would be one unit. You can add another unit in. So this would be the DR or the recovery zone that can be implemented. And again, this is all managed by the centralized management environment, over secure environments, lockdown firewalls. So in this whole deployment, we have multiple recoveries options. And that's the key thing as well, is let's have multiple recovery options. If this one is valid, the nice thing is, if I'm doing 10 restores from here, I will slow it down. Physics is physics, IOPS are IOPS. I start restoring from here as well. And if need be, I can restore from here. So I can have multiple restore points. Once I've done my cleansing and verification process, I can do more restores from multiple locations. Don't do it from one, let's use all of it. Okay.
Yeah, so a little bit of a Blue Peter moment in some respects with that side. I think, you know, what we're kind of covering there is there's obviously the functional components in that kind of security architecture, and that just kind of gives you a view of one form of how you could do that. Ultimately, of course, there are multiple different options, multiple different vendors and other bits, and you have to judge what's right for you. Though, of course, with the fact of having so many options, it can always be a bit challenging to work out where to start and how to make it real. And you always, to be bluntly honest, you have to be a bit careful, should we say, of the over-embellished sales speech that you get from some vendors in terms of their level of how confident they are on some configurations. Technically possible, but requires a lot of work on your side or a lot of considerations to be taken into account. So just make sure you dig that little bit deeper when you are doing checking on what people are saying to you as well. Now, to the essence and to the intent, as we started at the beginning, you know, this is not intended as a sales pitch, but ultimately, you know, obviously we want to kind of give you options. But what we want to do in terms of that whole context to support you to look at how your journey is, we'll make resources available to you. So you just have to, you know, request these if you'd like. But essentially, it's stuff that we'd even use with customers. So a little bit like a workload assessment workbook. So this just kind of gives you, it's fairly simple, but it's quite useful in terms of giving something that we'd start with around doing that initial workload priority assessment. How do you do that first conversation with a business, and how do you get some visibility of what you need to do where? What we'd also do as well is we've obviously covered quite a lot of overarching context and detail. However, there's a lot of depth behind what we've talked about today that we could spend the next 3 days talking about if anyone was that interested. So what we have done as well is just provided that you can request as well, essentially a little bit more of a summary and a little bit more depth behind the details that we've shared today. And that's really there to act as that guidebook. And as I say, it's more built around the function, but of course, it does give you some insight into how you could do that, you know, in a good old Blue Peter moment, if you wanted to, you're going to choose through that. Of course, you know, with that, you know, if you want to kind of start your journey around taking that modernization, you know, request your copy of the guidance resources. There's no obligation or expectation on you if you do that. It's just, you know, sharing with you. We certainly then recommend you kind of conduct that awareness and requirement session with the business. You know, ultimately the businesses are becoming much more aware, but there's still education that needs to happen. You know, there's still that awareness of actually the need of how this integrates into the continuity side. You know, I have conversations on a pretty regular basis, but in the context of working with different continuity teams, there's still elements of disconnect between that technology side and the need to actually bring services back online and how that ties in. So it's good to conduct that, you know, leverage some of the stuff we use today potentially, and work then to be able to complete that service definition design exercise. You know, we've talked about a number of components. You don't have to go and use every single one. Ultimately, it comes down to what your risk is, appetite from the business, and hence, you know, what kind of priority or investment profile can you take around the whole speed and resiliency. And so that's really what it'll come down to. Yes, there's best practices. Yes, there's guidance around what you ideally should do, but ultimately you have to find out what you can do that will work for your business, that will give them the confidence they need. But you can play that back really nicely by having that kind of risk conversation with the business around, the whole speed and resiliency side. And ultimately then, implement your plan. But really key is to ensure you do have that ongoing service resource, because ultimately this is not a set and forget. We have to maintain it. You can't manage that security profile without having vigilance. So you need to be able to think about that. To support you, again, in this context, speak to your power account manager. But for those that have attended today as well, we like to obviously give something back for you attending. You're giving your time to us. So we'd be happy to offer to you a free of charge. It's basically a light health check. So we'll spend a couple of hours with you working through kind of what your environment setup is today, how that kind of environment kind of maps out and looks like. I'll basically help you to map out that first level service definition. Now that, again, no obligation or expectation, but you can use that then to either take and run with, or take and modify, depending on what makes sense for your good selves. Now, of course, like in any kind of session, wouldn't be there if I didn't tell you that we could obviously help you out with all these things, but these pieces are there, no obligation, no other bits. They're just to really kind of give you that support. If you did want to, of course, work with us, one of the things that we do have and we find that's quite common is we've talked about what you want to get to. You don't get there immediately. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's going to have to be something that we actually work to, design, implement, and move through. So we do kind of very commonly work as well with customers to help kind of take more of an additive approach. So if you just want to get more confidence around your resilience to a ransomware or a cyber attack, very commonly we would help provide something like that vendor agnostic immutable storage that you can tag on to any backup configuration that you have today. And that provides that resilience. Might not necessarily give you the full speed, but it gives you that resilience and other moving parts. So it moves you forward in a positive way. You can then, of course, then start to go through, do the full kind of implement a proper secure by design. And if you wanted to as well, and you needed that assistance, then we can help you with that kind of ongoing data health and security monitoring resource and work very much in partnership with your teams. And we do that from a point of view of what we call our smart recovery, but whether that be across backup, or whether that be right up to the DR side, then we can take that through, and you'll probably see obviously a number of similar components there. I'm not going to dwell a lot on it, but ultimately, whether it's solution parts, whether it's advisory, or whether it's that actual ongoing active management, we can have your back and work with you as a partner alongside you and just give you that extra level of assurance that things are going to go the right way. So from that, thank you obviously very much for spending your time. We did have a little bit of time left just before the end of the session. So if there were questions that anyone wanted to ask, we're of course more than happy to answer. Of course, what you can do as well is obviously follow up with us post if you have any questions coming through. But if you do, please just drop them on. Or I can see one piece kind of coming through. One question is, how do you find and choose your primary backup location? There's just one that was asked. So, Kev, whether you want to cover or I can cover.
Yeah, no, that's fine. At the end of the day, that's going to come down to your primary backup location is going to be where your critical systems are. So it's basically speed. If we have 100 terabytes to back up, we need to back them up over a high speed environment. We don't want to be backing them up over high latency links, which can actually kill type systems. So yeah, but it's all down to speeds and feeds. So the higher the actual speed. But one thing to remember is, I get this a lot where people have gone, right, we've just put in 10 gig throughout the whole backup environment, and we've got 10 gig in our core environment, but actually we're only getting a certain speed. Well, again, it's still physics. If the actual backup repository, the primary storage repository you're protecting can only deliver a certain throughput, then you might find out that a couple of 1 gig ports were fast enough. So this is understanding your primary backup requirements to not overspec something. You might be putting 10 gig in just because it's simple, it's available, and that's all you've got now. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to speed up some of your backups, because that'll be depending on how you build your architecture. Remote sites are twofold. We can either, you've got an option. If you've got a low data size count on a remote location, let's say 400 or 500 gig, and we want to back that up without putting a backup server over there, that's fine. That can be done directly from the remote site to the primary backup environment. Two things to consider. One, if I need to recover that, will my RTO work? If it takes me 14 hours to recover it, is that acceptable? Because we don't have a local copy of a full system, so we can't do a full system recovery, let's say in 30 minutes. we'd have to work around that. But in most cases, I've worked with people go, well, we're backed up over the network to a main environment. We're going to build a replacement machine, restore it locally, then go and ship it out because the machine's broken. But again, if you do need a remote on-site backup device, we actually use a very low profile unit. Basically, it looks like a standard short switch, fits in a switch cabinet, and it can protect up to 10 terabytes on the remote site. The nice thing is it's hidden out of the way. It can do all the local protection, excuse me, do the encrypted replication, so you've still got your multiple copies. So bringing it right back to the question is speeds and feeds requirements and latency is the key thing.
Cool. All right. Well, we're just basically coming to time. I can see a few other bits and pieces. What we can do is obviously pick up on those as follow-up actions. But what we'd just like to say then is thank you everyone for attending. You know, obviously we take this as a commitment of your time, so we do very much appreciate it. We'd obviously just like to say thank you. And as I say, if you are interested in getting access to some of those resources we mentioned, then do just kind of reach out to us and we'll be happy to arrange that for you. And if you even would like to potentially take up that kind of free health check cyber side of things, then equally welcome to reach out to your account manager and put yourself forward as someone who would like to take advantage of that. But we hope you found that useful today, and certainly we do thank you again for your attendance. But otherwise, that brings us to the end of our session. Thanks very much, and thanks, Kevin, as well.
Great. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.